Manhattan Beach, California. The scene, it is alleged, of one of the biggest and most bizarre cases of sexual abuse of children in anyone's memory. Today, nearly 5 years after the school closed down, the case against the people who ran it has finally gone to the jury. Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. It's the longest and most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history, and almost since the beginning there have been suggestions that it never needed to take place. That's our story tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
It may be, when all is said and done, when the jury in the McMartin preschool case has sifted through the more than 50,000 pages of trial transcripts, it may be that there will be one or more findings of guilt. It may be, in other words, that the legal process produces the conclusion that some little children actually were sexually abused. But it is doubtful that anyone will conclude that the way this trial was handled and covered by the media reflects much credit on either U.S. journalism or the U.S. legal system. Innocent people have had their reputations smeared and their lives turned upside down. Very young children who may or may not have been sexually abused have certainly been traumatized by endless hours of relentless examination and cross-examination in pretrial and courtroom hearings. Whatever else will be said about the McMartin case, it will never be cited as a proud example of our criminal justice system. Here's the background from Nightline correspondent James Walker.
This is the McMartin preschool where the sexual abuse allegedly took place. These pictures were taken in January 1984, just days before the school was closed. It is located in an upper middle-class suburb of Los Angeles called Manhattan Beach. What made this case so sensational, so gruesome, was the accusation that 41 youngsters over a 6-year period had not just been sexually molested, but had also been forced to participate in satanic rites and pornographic pictures. There were also charges that to keep the children quiet, animals had been mutilated before their eyes. To add to the sensationalism, the 7 people arrested were not only pillars of the community, they were also responsible for the children's welfare. 3 generations of McMartins were arrested. Grandmother Virginia, daughter Peggy McMartin Bucky, her son Raymond Bucky, his sister Peggy Ann Bucky, as well as 3 teachers. At their arraignment in April 1984, the prosecutor said the defendants were so dangerous they should be jailed without bail. 5 of them were. The parents of the children were incensed.
I want them out of society forever. They should never, ever be allowed to be with other children or anybody else, for that matter.
The defendants faced more than 300 counts of sodomy, rape, and oral copulation. The evidence of abuse was largely developed by social worker Key McFarland, who used puppets to get the children who were between the ages of 2 and 6 to reveal what had happened. Babette Spittler was one of the defendants. A teacher at the school, she was charged with molestation and jailed for 2.5 months before the charges were dropped. She says McFarland brainwashed the children.
She had no proof of anything when she interviewed any of those kids. But she didn't assume that anybody was innocent. She assumed we were all guilty.
But the children in the interviews said that they had been...
Do they really? Or are the puppets saying something happened after they'd been questioned and questioned and questioned?
They met with me for an hour, and they were gone out of my life and I out of theirs. The concept that somehow magically this could have turned them into children who came to believe that they were raped and sodomized is an incredible one to me.
In June 1984, the preliminary hearing began. Its purpose, to decide if enough evidence existed to bring the 7 to trial. 41 children were supposed to testify. 13 did, in what one defense lawyer described as a relentless grinding of their testimony. This couple's 6-year-old daughter testified for 4 difficult days. Just the courtroom setting itself, they say, bothered their child.
The courtroom is a very intimidating place, and when the child's in there, they see 7 defendants, 7 attorneys, which adds up to 14 bad guys in their eyes, and maybe 2 people on their side plus a parent. That's very imbalanced and frightening for the child to see that.
Anytime a child testifies as to molestation, it's exceedingly emotional and damaging evidence. You're just going to have to give it full swing through cross-examination.
The preliminary hearing, which lasted 18 months, ended with a stunning development. While Raymond Buckey and his mother were held for trial, charges against the other 5 were dropped for lack of evidence. The second shocker came days later when 2 members of the prosecution asked to be taken off the case. Glenn Stevens claimed there was no evidence. He later sold his story to a Hollywood producer. In April 1987, 4 years after the first accusations of child abuse, the trial began. Ray Buckey pleaded not guilty to 81 counts of child molesting, his mother to 21 counts. In February 1989, after spending 5 years in jail, Ray Buckey was released on bail. 9 children testified at the trial. For some, it was their 6th description of the alleged abuse. 4 other children declined. Their parents felt they were too fragile to go on. Throughout it all, the Buckeys remained adamant about their innocence.
Did you ever molest any of those children?
Never.
It's true, when I'm very nervous, I probably have said some things that are not quite correct, and I'll grant it and I'll admit that.
Including Mr. Buckey, whether or not you molested children in this case?
No, Mr. Rubin, I know that I did not molest children ever in my life.
The trial has become a marathon. It's cost so far over $15 million, the most expensive criminal court case in U.S. history. It's generated over 50,000 pages of transcripts and over 1,000 pieces of evidence. 124 witnesses have testified. Why has it gone on for so long? Defense attorneys say the case has been out of control from the start, from the moment the prosecution filed over 300 counts against 7 defendants.
I think you have to view the nature of the case as pled by the district attorney. It's gigantic. It's completely unwieldy. No one knows how to deal with a case of this size. Because of that, the length of the case is dragged on and dragged on.
The parents of the McMartin children who testified blame the defense for the delays. For example, in 1985, during the preliminary hearing, 10-year-old Brian spent 16 days on the witness stand, 15 and a half being grilled by the defense. In 1988, during the trial, Brian spent 6 days on the stand, 5 and a half taken up by the defense. A jury of 12 men and women will now decide the innocence of Ray Buckey and his mother. They will have to sort out difficult questions such as how, for example, the children's compelling story of abuse could go on for so long without anyone noticing. But beyond what happens to the Buckeys, this case has also turned into a trial of the legal system itself, of the rights of defendants to a fair trial at the expense of children who have been repeatedly questioned and badgered about sexually intimate details in a case that has gone on now for 6 years. I'm James Walker for Nightline in Los Angeles.
When we come back, we'll talk with the dean of a California law school. He has been following the McMartin case for most of the past 6 years. We'll be talking with a Los Angeles television critic who accuses the media of what he calls knee-jerk hip shooting in covering the story. And with a former prosecutor of child abuse cases who now trains others in how to deal with the issue. Gerald Ullman is dean of the Santa Clara Law School in Santa Clara, California. A former federal prosecutor, he's been closely following the McMartin case since it began. He's with us now from our affiliate, KGO's bureau in San Jose, California. Joining us in our Los Angeles bureau is Howard Rosenberg, television critic for the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Rosenberg has been outspoken in expressing his concern over media coverage of the McMartin case. And with us from Richmond, Virginia, is Jim Peters. As a prosecuting attorney in Washington State, he dealt with more than 30 child abuse cases. He is now senior attorney at the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse. Howard, because I would like to begin with this in the macro sense, the broadest possible sense, let's talk about mass media coverage of the case. What's wrong with it?
Well, I think, the media, when confronted by a preponderance of information about a suspect from one side, frequently tends to do more than just report that information. They tend to very quickly become converts. And I think that's really what happened in the McMartin case in the early days. There was like this hysterical atmosphere, I think, that the media contributed to. A lot of it was on local newscasts out here. Some of it even on the network, on a 2020 segment, for example, that I can recall, you know, the segment just all but indicted these people and almost convicted them and hanged them ahead of time, even before the trial. It was appalling. They threw in a couple of allegedlys, but it hardly balanced the kind of accusatory tone of the reporting. By the time the piece was over, you know, saying these people were allegedly guilty had about the same kind of impact as saying that Dr. Mengele was an alleged war criminal. It just wasn't balanced out.
Mr. Ullman, for some reason or another, the jury in this case was never sequestered. That is, it was, I gather, always able, if it wanted to watch television, listen to the radio. For all we know, even now they are not sequestered. They could be watching this program tonight. Isn't it inevitable that the kind of coverage in this case is going to have an impact on a jury?
I think that's quite likely, but I don't see how you could sequester a jury for 2.5 years and isolate them from their family and friends and associates. The burdens on this jury are just incredible in terms of having their lives turned upside down for 2.5 years. I think that is beyond what we should ask any jury to endure.
But you are suggesting that somehow one could have known at the very beginning of this trial that it was going to run longer than any trial in the history of U.S. criminal proceedings.
I think this was all foreseeable right from the beginning. And
because?
Because the case was overcharged, plain and simple. And I think it was done deliberately for political reasons, to advance the political career of the prosecutor who initiated this case.
When you say overcharged, what do you mean?
I mean that to take any case and charge 300 counts, 42 victims, and put it all into one case is just more than the system can digest. It's just biting off more than the system can chew. The case could have been broken up into smaller parts. It didn't all have to go to trial in one piece with 7 different defendants and 300 counts.
Could the judge, should the judge in this case have just said to the prosecution, you're going overboard, I want this thing reduced, I want half a dozen charges brought rather than 300 charges brought? Was that within his jurisdiction?
It was. A motion for severance could have been granted by the judge to carve up the case, to separate some of the defendants and try them separately, and to proceed with the case in smaller bits and pieces.
Now, Mr. Peters, talk to me for a moment about these children. Have we learned anything over the course of this trial in terms of how youngsters who may or may not have been sexually abused? I mean, we still don't have a verdict in this trial after all the 5 years that we've been talking about it. Do we have better ways of handling this issue than we did at the beginning of this trial?
Yes, Ted, I think that we clearly do. And I'm not in a position to talk about this case or the victims in this case, but clearly since 1984, things have changed for the better, I think, both from the standpoint of advocating on behalf of victims and certainly people who are representing defendants, I think, are quite a bit more attuned to understanding these cases and dealing with them, not just because of McMartin, but because there's been a heightened public awareness about the issue of sexual abuse, and these cases have come before the courts at a much greater rate than ever before in history in the last 5 years.
The McMartin case, in point of fact, almost started an avalanche of these kinds of cases and of charges being brought. There really are a great many similarities between the old witch hunts, I mean, I'm talking about literally the witch hunts a few hundred years ago, and what happened here.
Well, one of the big differences between the witch hunts of a few hundred years ago is there weren't any witches. And certainly, I disagree with you that the McMartin case started an avalanche of cases. I was involved in trying child abuse cases in the late 1970s, and the McMartin case is a unique case. It's an aberration, but I don't think it started any avalanche at all. I disagree with that.
All right. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to have each of you draw some conclusions on what the McMartin case has taught us and where we might be able to go legally in terms of media coverage and also in terms of how to handle these youngsters. We'll continue our conversation in a moment. And we're back with Gerald Ullman and Howard Rosenberg and Jim Peters. Mr. Ullman, is anyone going to pay any price once this trial is finally over? The the prosecutors whom you charged with excessive zeal and political ambition? Is anything going to happen to them? The judge who may not have handled this trial with quite the competence that might have been desired. Anything going to happen to the judge? Are there any consequences, in other words, when you have what everyone seems to regard as a pretty lousy trial?
Well, the prosecutor who initiated the trial is gone. He was defeated for election in 1984, and the prosecutor who is currently in charge of the case actually succeeded in trimming the case somewhat. I think the case would have gone on for 5 years if he hadn't had the political courage to dismiss the case totally against 5 of the defendants. In terms of the judge and the other participants, I think there's plenty of blame to go around, but I would hope that we won't spend a lot of time in recrimination, but start looking for ways that this kind of trial can be avoided in the future. I think we need to develop ways within the criminal justice system of isolating the mega trial, assigning it to judges and prosecutors who are experienced in moving these cases along, spend more time trimming the case in advance. And unfortunately, the case is now being used as a vehicle to make changes in the system that I think will make it even more difficult to control these kinds of cases in the future.
Give me a very quick for instance, and then I want to go on to
Well, for instance, we have another criminal justice initiative coming up on the ballot in California in which it's proposed to make preliminary hearings much shorter by using hearsay evidence to allow direct indictment to go directly to trial. I think these are the tools we have within the system to prune cases and get them into shape before trial. And I think it would be silly to change those procedures when the risk of that change is to make trials even longer.
Howard Rosenberg.
I disagree with that.
Who does?
That's Jim Peters.
Go ahead, Jim.
I disagree with the thought that by allowing for direct indictment, it's going to make for longer trials. I came from a state, Washington, where direct indictment occurs every day, and having prosecuted many child abuse cases in that state from 1977 through 1987, I never did a case that lasted longer than 3 weeks.
Explain for me quickly, what is meant by direct indictment?
That is where the prosecutor makes a determination that he or she believes there is probable cause, takes it before a judge with an affidavit setting forth that probable cause, and instead of engaging in a lengthy preliminary hearing, as occurred in the McMartin case, I understand it lasted 18 months, that finding is made by a judge in a much more simplified manner and cuts down, as a matter of fact, on the length of proceedings, not lengthens it.
I'd ask you to consider what would have happened if McMartin had gone directly to trial on an indictment, on 300 counts, 42 victims, 7 defendants. The case would be half over at this point. 5 innocent people would have been subjected to a 4 or 5 year trial. At least the preliminary hearing in this case succeeded in culling out a lot of the charges that were unfounded.
Well, sir, neither you nor I know whether those 5 people were innocent. The judge at the preliminary hearing who heard the evidence bound them over for trial. It was the prosecutor, the new prosecutor in Los Angeles, who made the determination not to proceed. We don't, either one of us, know whether they are guilty or innocent.
The prosecutor himself, in dismissing those charges, indicated they were probably innocent. He did not have sufficient evidence to proceed to trial to convict them.
All right,
well,
Mr. Ullman, Mr. Peters,
hold on. They are, in fact, innocent.
I'm afraid what we're going to have to conclude at this point that we're going to stop insofar as our discussion of the legal ramifications of this case are concerned. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll be talking with Howard Rosenberg about some of the media implications of this case. We'll continue our conversation in a moment. And continuing our conversation now with Howard Rosenberg of the Los Angeles Times. Let's pick up on Mr. Ullman's characterization of the politically ambitious prosecutors. What would you have had, most particularly the local media in Los Angeles, do when quite clearly there's a lot of oil being thrown on the fire every day here? You want them to keep saying, well, it's just being thrown on the fire by politically ambitious prosecutors.
No, it's not exactly what they reported, it's the tone. I mean, there was like an hysterical tone to much of the reporting and an accusatory tone to much of the reporting. And I don't think it's something you can just isolate, you know, with McMartin. I think, if anything, the McMartin case was an extension of and dramatized the way we in the media, and especially television because of its emphasis on pictures, cover a lot of stories, especially crime stories. I mean, a lot of it has to do with just the way we sort of cavalierly, I think, smear reputations and play loosely with reputations. And one way it's done, forget about people who are indicted, but it's done just showing people on television being apprehended. We now have we have live drug busts. We have almost nightly on the local news scenes of people being led away in handcuffs. We don't know the ultimate disposition of those cases. For all we know, once they get to the police station, these people are freed because of lack of evidence, but the stigma through the pictures lives on indefinitely.
All points well taken, Eric, but given what you know to be the exceedingly competitive nature of the relationship among local stations on the local level and among the networks on the national level, is there anything that you feel can be done about that, or is likely to be done about that?
You know, I'd like to say we've learned our lesson from McMartin, but I don't think we have, because I see the same thing in various degrees going on still. And I think it's still up to the individual news operations themselves, whether it's television or newspapers, to really use restraint. After all, we're playing with something that's more valuable to people than almost anything but their families, and that's their reputations.
Howard Rosenberg, thank you very much. Gerald Ullman and Jim Peters, I thank all of you for joining us this evening. Tomorrow night, we will recall an event that has special meaning for those of us here at Nightline, since it provided the platform for this program. It was 10 years ago that American hostages were seized at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, beginning one of the more painful episodes in our recent history. Joining us in our look back, former President Jimmy Carter. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been Nightline.
This has been a presentation of ABC News.